gentlemen and barbarians of all ages, it's time to frickin' go, and I mean go and go and go, and don't stop until you reach the end of the dungeon or run out of time and you're hell-tied or whatever you're doing, because today it's time to talk about my favorite new Barbarian build, completely created by the existence of Season 3. It's because of changes to Barbarian this season, and also it giving us our brand new unique, the Ring of the Ravenous. The main purpose of this is when you use a brawling skill, it applies 2 stacks of bleed from your rend. Combine that with the massive buffs we've gotten to charge this season, both making its damage incredibly actually competitive, while also giving it much less situational cooldown reduction, making it much more applicable, and then combine that with a bit of CDR on your gear, and you can basically just permanently be charging now if there are 3 or more enemies in front of you, which most content will actively give you. Let's be upfront though, it doesn't do the damage of Hammer the Ancients, especially to bosses, but this build is still extremely good, in the top handful for Barb for sure, and that means just by that nature, it's one of the better builds in the game. And what it does even better than a Hammer and the Ancients build actually is something quite simple but important: speed farming. The vast majority of our damage against groups of enemies comes from our charge in this build, which resets its own cooldown on use and is of course also a movement ability. So in dense enough spaces like nightmare dungeons or vaults, you can literally charge from start to finish unless there's some sort of awkward intermission, and part of what makes all this work is a really fun interaction that does involve the changed unconstrained passive, which also got a massive buff in this patch. So put simply, this isn't the highest damage Barb build, and it won't one-shot a boss the way that Hammer of the Ancients does, but it is the only Barb build that is actually straight up new completely this season, is more than competitive. It's probably the best speed farming build that we have for Barb right now, which is honestly what the endgame is about at this point now that Abattoir of Zir is gone again, and also, it's just plain fun. It's enjoyable to be the choo-choo train of death, smushing your enemies into the wall in a build that I like to call Rush of Blood. As far as the background footage though that you'll be seeing here, I'm not quite completely optimized yet. This is the version of it that I've hobbled together while working my way towards 100, so when you have all the right stuff properly, the damage is going to be significantly higher than even this, as I don't even have Tybalt's Will yet as an example myself. But even so, in this unoptimized version, I am smashing through a Nightmare Vault nearly 35 levels above me at Mach speed, no danger at all until the final room, just because of the traps themselves. All that said, let's get into it then. The skill points, the technique slots, of course, the legendaries and uniques that you need to make this build actually function, then also to optimize it later on, the stats and affixes that you want to aim for on your gear, how you want to build your Seneschal construct companion, your Paragon board setup, and then just how to play and any tips that I have from my time messing around and optimizing a charge build this season so far. Starting off then with the skill tree, for our basic skill we are going to be taking Frenzy, as well as Enhanced Frenzy and also Combat Frenzy. In this build, the only times that you will use your basic skill are against bosses for Fury Generation, or if you mess up a charge and have to wait out the cooldown. Due to charge being our main thing as well, we don't really need the movement of, say, Lunging Strike as a basic skill, so instead we're taking Frenzy, mostly for Combat Frenzy, giving us up to 24% bonus damage reduction at 3 stacks, especially good when you're fighting bosses, of course. Then we're going to be moving on to our core skills, and of course we're taking the full 5 ranks of Rend here, and you of course want bonus ranks on your gloves as a goal as well. We also take Enhanced Rend here too, and then also Violent Rend. As a whole, what this gives you is a big cleaving arc attack in front of you that applies a load of bleed damage and also extends the duration of active vulnerable debuffs on enemies, as well as doing bonus damage against vulnerable targets. Then we go to our defensive cluster, and here we are taking our only shout in this build. Lovely times that we live in that I can even say that. Challenging Shout. If you are having no survival issues, you could go for Rallying Cry instead for some resource generation. That only really helps out for bosses, as resource is just a non-factor for mobbing anyways in this build. So Challenging Shout, also its enhancement, and then also Tactical Challenging Shout too. As a whole, this taunts nearby enemies, gives you a bonus massive chunk of damage reduction, and also gives you bonus fury when you take damage while the shout is active too. This is basically your oh shit defensive cooldown. Packs of elites just appeared in front of you, surprising near one shot just hit you, something like that. You want to press Challenging Shout in those moments. The other use of this comes from the Martial Paragon glyph, which now makes shouts lower the cooldown of non-shouts by 4 seconds on use, which is the main reason that we have this over a different defensive skill like Iron Skin, for example, which is probably better if you didn't want to shout, but we use this for the purpose of lowering cooldown on charge, both in case you mess up and miss the 3 target threshold for the cooldown reduction, and also just for bosses, as it just gets you bonus charges against bosses pretty frequently. Then we take 3 ranks of the Imposing Presence passive over here for just a nice bonus to our maximum health, and also 3 ranks of Martial Vigor for damage reduction from elites. After that we come to our fun little cluster over here, the Brawling skills, and of course we're going to be maxing out the ranks on charge itself, as well as taking both its enhancement and also power charge. Of course we want to get maximum ranks into this from gear as well. You want bonus ranks on your legs, unless you're using a unique there. You want bonus ranks to all brawling skills on your amulet as well, and you can get the ranks of this pretty damn high as a result. And I don't even have the skill rank increased tuning stone or a Shaco either, of course, so it still has way more room to gain. You also want to take the enhancement as well as power charge too, and this will give you as a whole a forward charging attack that does a buttload of damage, stuns enemies that collide with a wall, and also lowers its own cooldown by 3 seconds per enemy hit up to 9 seconds maximum, and also lowers its own cooldown by 6 seconds against bosses. I've got my cooldown down to 9.1 seconds as a base. I could shave off that last 0.1 with a slightly better affix roll here or there, but it's sort of irrelevant to that point because that's about how long it takes to register the hits and give you the CDR anyways. So essentially, once you have it around 9.3 seconds or so, you just have a permanent charge. The second that your charge is finished actually going, if you hit 3 enemies, it will be back off cooldown. Simple as that. Then we just take a bunch of berserking focus passives here too, 3 ranks of aggressive resistance for a pretty sizable boost to damage reduction when you are actually berserking itself. Then we're also going to be taking 3 ranks of battle fervor, which gives you berserking for 3 seconds after you use a brawling skill. This is actually super important, and we'll talk about why more specifically in a moment. Then we're also going to be taking 3 ranks of prolific fury, which is just a nice boost to your resource generation while berserking, again mostly for boss fights specifically, this is. After that we move to weapon mastery, and in theme with the build we are of course taking rupture itself, as well as its enhancement, and then also warrior's rupture. What this does as a whole then is give you a way to pop any active bleed on enemies, add a bunch of new bleed to them when you do so, and then also gain some attack speed for doing it. The main purpose of this is sort of as a combo with charge. If you somehow charge a group and something is still alive at the end and it's like 1 or 2 enemies, so it's not worth another charge, you just want to pop a rupture and clear them out in a big ball of bloody mist. Also again, fantastic for bosses, which is where charge has its only real struggles. Then we take a bunch of passives here, and this gets a little bit fun. Of course, 3 ranks of pit fighter for bonus damage to close enemies and also damage reduction from distant ones, 1 rank of no mercy, which gives you bonus crit chance against stunned or slowed enemies, which we do a fair bit of. And then we of course have 1 rank of exposed vulnerability, a neat little synergy of the build. So what this does is after using a weapon mastery skill, such as rupture of course, your next core skill will apply vulnerable to an enemy for 1 second. So after we use rupture, our next rend applies vulnerable. What else does our rend do? Extend the duration of vulnerable by 2 seconds. This affects any larger health pool enemies, but again bosses, and the main way that we use this is to use rupture, then use rend twice, and then you just have to rend once every 2 seconds at minimum to keep vulnerable up permanently, which the build does struggle with otherwise. So this is a nice little fix to that problem. You may be asking why only 1 rank of exposed vulnerability if that's the case, and the answer is you just don't need more than that. You rupture, then you rend to apply the vulnerable, then you do your second rend within 1 second, no problem at that speed, to extend it. So anything more here is actually just a waste of points really. Then we move on to our ultimate skill, and of course this is going to be Wrath of the Berserker over here. This gives you Berserk and Unstoppable for 5 seconds, and makes basic skills cast within 10 seconds give you 5 seconds of berserking as well. We also have both enhancements for this, having it give you bonus resource generation and movement speed while active, and also giving it a scaling damage buff, where for every 50 fury that you spend while this is active, the damage bonus of berserking goes up by 25%, up to 100% at max for 200 fury spent. The really neat part about this though is that this buff is actually snapshotable, because the way that the game does buffs in general, until you lose a buff, you keep the highest version of it that you've had. Or to put it simply, once you have the berserking damage buff from Wrath of the Berserker, you keep that until you stop berserking. Wrath of the Berserker itself ends after only a few seconds, but the damage bonus that you build up will stay until berserking falls off. Then we round back to that fun thing from earlier, brawling skills giving us berserking for 3 seconds, and now you see the beauty of it coming together. If you use charge while you still have the Wrath of the Berserker bonus, you essentially extend its active time. Because of our setup, we use charge more than once every few seconds, and so we actually stack active duration on berserking to be even higher than that, and rather than reactivating a low berserking, keeping it active for long periods of time after this is what lets you snapshot all the bonus damage. To round that up in a far less complex way really, the game functions in a way that lets you keep the damage bonus from this ultimate skill at pretty much 100% uptime, and that is absolutely the right way to play with it as a result. All that said, we move on to our key passive here with our final skill point, and of course it's going to be unconstrained. It just fits. It increases the maximum damage bonus of berserking in the first place, and this of course stacks with the bonus from Wrath of the Berserker. Using them correctly together, you can have a pretty much just permanent 200% damage bonus, and it's a bonus that applies to charge, applies to rend, applies to our bleeds, literally everything that we do. And that's all for the skill points then, and how everything sort of synergizes together. So let's now talk about our technique slot, which for this build is going to be two-handed axe. Well, you could just technically go two-handed sword for pure bleed damage increase, but the secret sauce of the build isn't actually the bleed itself, it just helps out. And what axe technique does is give us bonus damage to vulnerable enemies, which also translate into bleed damage through a Paragon board, as well as through our rend actually getting bonus damage against vulnerable things. So it lets us double dip into both of these things rather than only going pure bleed. With that then, let's talk about the big orange and golden items for the build, the legendaries and uniques that make the build shine. As far as the uniques then, the most important one by an absolute mile is the brand new one, the Ring of the Ravenous. We talked about this earlier, but it extends the duration of the bleed on rend, letting you stack it to higher amounts before popping it with a rupture, but also makes brawling skills apply to stacks of the bleed too. This is also a ring with ranks of brawling skills, vulnerable damage, crit chance, and damage to bleeding, all of which are pretty damn solid for this build, of course. As you can see, I got pretty much the worst imaginable roll on it in like every way possible, but even just having it in the first place is a giant bonus to this playstyle and makes it function in the first place, honestly. Then we have Ramelodni's Magnum Opus. Skills using this weapon deal up to 0.4% more multiplicative damage per each point of fury you have when casting them, but you'll lose 2 fury per second. Endgame Barb Fury Generation just outpaces this, especially in a build that uses charge over core skills, and you can set charge to use one-handed weapons to get this full bonus from it. Then we have the uniques that I don't have yet. Tybalt's Will is insane for this build. 40% multiplicative damage bonus is absolutely nuts, of course. Charge grants Unstoppable, and we have it at a near nothing cooldown, so we always have the damage bonus, and the Unstoppable that Charge grants is momentary, not a timer, which is really important because by the same functions as our Berserking snapshot, we come out ahead here. What Tybalt's Will says on the actual piece of gear is when you gain Unstoppable, you get 50 of your primary resource. This means by the same rules as earlier, if you get Unstoppable while you are already unstoppable, this won't trigger. You won't get the Fury. But because Charge is only momentary Unstoppable instead of on a timer, you get it as a fully fresh application of the buff every time you charge, which means every charge also grants us 50 Fury, so that's really fun too. Then we also have the Tusk Helm of Yoritz the Mighty. When gaining Berserking, while already Berserk, 40 to 60% chance to become more enraged, granting 15% bonus multiplicative damage, 2 Fury per second, and 10% cooldown reduction for the remainder of your Berserking, which again, our goal is to keep lasting forever anyways. This obviously just works perfectly well with what we're doing already, just giving you even more bonuses for the playstyle we're already running, and due to that, the cooldown reduction it gives us is pretty much permanent too, which means replacing a non-unique helmet that had cooldown reduction is actually an even trade pretty much. No loss, if anything, just to gain. Just gain because of the other effects on it. Then we have our general legendary aspects. On your two-handed weapons for the double effectiveness bonus, we want Limitless Rage. This boosts the damage of rend for every fury generated past your maximum, and interestingly enough, this does also trigger on the rend procs from charge, meaning once you have Tybalt's Will, charge will both generate 50 fury and proc Limitless Rage on the rend stacks to boost the damage instantly, making it a really nasty 1-2 combo. Then we also, on a two-handed weapon, of course, have Edge Masters, just boosting our damage in relation to how much of our maximum fury we actually have, and again, it affects all of our skills and all of our damage, and we're barely using our actual core skill, barely actually spending fury, which makes this exceedingly strong. Then on our one-handed weapon, we of course have the Ancestral Charge aspect. This just makes your actual charge come out in a sort of horizontal line on either side of you, dealing up to 30% of the original damage with the extra, like, ghostly men. The big deal with this is that it extends the range of your charge outwards, making it easier to hit more enemies and thus reset the cooldown. But also, it will apply full rend stacks whether they are hit by your main body or by the extended range, so it still does great damage even if they are only hit by the outer edges regardless. Then on your ring, you of course want the Unrelenting Fury aspect. This gives you up to a 30% refund on fury spent if the core skill kills an enemy or hits a boss, and the only time that we're actually spending fury on using rend properly is either to build Wrath of the Berserker damage, so the refund is right there obviously, or when fighting bosses where the refund is going to be guaranteed. After that, we have our amulet, which is going to be a defensive legendary in this build, specifically Iron Blood. I have mine on the helmet right now as just sort of a placeholder, so those numbers should of course be 1.5 times as big, but essentially 6% damage reduction per nearby bleeding enemy up to a maximum of 30%, which is extremely lovely. On our gloves then, we have the Weapon Master aspect for a bonus charge to our Rupture, again mostly for boss fights, and a 55% lucky hit chance to stun with it too, which is nice in general. Then for our defensive legendary slot remaining, we have the brand new Juggernaut aspect. A proper maximum roll of this at 925 item power is nearly 6,000 armor, which is absolutely nuts. You see, my armor right now is 8k, but Juggernaut isn't even active yet because I'm in a town. It goes up to nearly 14k when out of base, and yes, that is far over cap. I need to replace one of the total armor percent affixes in my gear, but just to point out how insanely strong Juggernaut actually is, especially as we don't lose much from the extended dodge cooldown that it gives us, thanks to our charge uptime being what it is. Then finally, on our boots, we have the Ghostwalker aspect. Again, this one is pretty simple, with our charge uptime being what it is. Unstoppable is pretty much constant, so the effect is always active. Bonus move speed and the ability to walk through enemies, but the walking through enemies is especially good in this build as it lets you set up better charges by actually lining up your enemies before setting it off. That does it for the uniques and legendaries then, so let's talk about gearing in general. For offense, you want lots of your main stat, of course. You want damage while berserking is a high priority. You want vulnerable damage as well. Close enemy damage isn't bad either. You want ranks of rend on your gloves. You want ranks of charge on your legs if you're not using Tybalt's Will. You want ranks of brawling on your amulet as well. Between your helm, whether it be regular helm, Yoritz, or even Shaco, if you're somehow that lucky to have that, and then also your amulet, you need to have high roll cooldown reduction affixes on both of them, so you hit at least 15% cooldown reduction as a stat in your stat list. That, combined with the ranks of charge that we have, makes it basically no cooldown at all against larger groups. Defensively, you just want the classics really. Damage reduction from close and distant. Damage reduction from bleeding is great for us too, as we of course make enemies bleed a hell of a lot. And then you specifically want your boots to be a haven for elemental resistances, with the ideal rolls on a pair of boots for this build being 3 high roll elemental resistances, then just a movement speed bonus. These boots are almost perfect. That's everything then you need to worry about with your gear, so let's talk about the seasonal mechanic, the Seneschal construct. Your skills here are pretty simple, probably a combo that you've seen going around a lot, honestly, and first we have Flash of Adrenaline as our first skill for a big bonus to our general damage whenever the skill is cast, Duration Support, which increases the duration that the skill is active for, Tactical Support, which lowers the cooldown of the skill, and it's worth mentioning that both of these at maximum ranks is actually 100% uptime, 12-second duration, 12-second cooldown. Then the final slot that I have right now is Safeguard Support for damage reduction while it's active too, but if I had this, it would be where the Genesis unique tuning stone would go here, which would boost the effectiveness of the supported skill by 150%, which would then make Flash of Adrenaline a 50% multiplicative damage bonus at full ranks, pretty much just permanently active, which is of course nuts. Then for our second skill, we have the Tempest Governing Stone, which just fires out a bunch of never-ending ticking dots that spread and get stronger whenever an enemy dies. And on it, we have Arcing Support to make it fire out basically just to more enemies at a time, Bleeding Support to turn 50% of the damage into bleed damage over time, but more importantly, making all enemies take bonus bleeding damage while they're moving, which, you guessed it, counts us charging them into a wall and the bleeds that apply from the charge itself combined with Rend. Then in the final slot, currently I have Breaking Support, which is great against any barriered enemies and also helps keep vulnerable uptime, but again, if I had it, this is where the Evernight unique soon would go, of course being +4 ranks to every skill, which is absolutely nuts. It lasts for 2 seconds after the skill is used, and Tempest fires off once every 0.9 seconds, which means Evernight stays permanently active for 4 bonus ranks to all skills all the time. So as you can see, this build has quite a lot of room to actually gain power still from what I have personally, but it also still works exceedingly well both at this point and in the proper endgame. With that covered, then let's move on to the big beauty that is our Paragon board setup for the day. From the starting board, you want to progress up the right side like so, and then we do a sort of snaking around motion around the glyph socket to actually get it itself. Then we're going to be sticking in the exploit glyph, both to increase our damage against vulnerable enemies and make enemies vulnerable for 3 seconds the first time that we hit them. Then you want to grab the easily accessible dexterity and the rare nodes as well before heading up the left side to exit of the board and sticking on the Blood Rage board up here with the legendary node in the top right side of it. Here you want to just go directly up and here towards the glyph socket itself, taking this little forking branch path to actually just grab these 4 strength nodes that are beautifully placed. You want to go through the rare magic nodes to get to the glyph socket here, and inside of this we're going to be putting the Ire glyph. This is probably the most important singular glyph for this build. It gives you bonus damage while berserking and also damage reduction from elites, which is nice too. You want to grab the remaining important rare and magic nodes here before heading out the right side to grab the legendary node itself, wrapping around over here to Blood Rage, which of course the power here is a 10% chance to get 5 seconds of berserking after you kill a bleeding enemy. But much more importantly, 25% of your damage while berserking stat is applied as a permanent multiplicative damage bonus to your character. We stack that affix like all hell, so this node just gives us a very, well, nice boost to our damage, and a very big double dip too. After that, we head out to the right, forking off to grab the damage while berserking rare and magic nodes up here. Then you want to head out the right side exit of the board and attach on the Carnage board with the legendary node on the bottom side of it. So to start off with, you want to go directly towards the actual glyph socket here, going right along and then up through the actual magic and rare nodes themselves, and in the socket you want to put in the Martial glyph. This one only works in this spot once it's level 15, but once it is, it fits like a glove, increasing the power of some nearby nodes, which is quite important, but more importantly giving us the 4-second cooldown reduction on all abilities when casting a shout. We then grab the rare and magic nodes in the area before going up to the right corner of this to actually get the damage while berserking rare and magic nodes here too. Then you want to leave the site alone for now and instead head down the bottom of the board from the earlier point here through even more damage while berserking rare and magic nodes, which are of course extremely important. These ones also coming with damage to elite, which also is a really big deal. After that, you want to go down to the bottom side of the board and exit it to attach on the Warbringer board with the legendary power and the glyph socket in the top right side. You want to wrap right around to the actual legendary node itself as quickly as possible, going through the maximum fury increased nodes, and what the power itself is it gives you 15% of your maximum life as Fortify for every 75 fury that you spend. Of course, again, in our general gameplay, we don't actually spend that much fury, but what we do is spend a lot of fury before we start an engagement so that we can actually gain that Fortify, and also it of course affects us for bosses, which is really important too in its own way. Then we want to wrap back around to the top to the glyph socket on this board, and here we're going to be putting the Territorial glyph for bonus damage against close enemies and damage reduction from them as well. You want to grab the rare and relevant magic nodes in the radius as well before moving back up to the Carnage board, and this time exiting out of the right side, attaching on the Decimator board like so with the legendary power at the top. Here you want to go right and up to get these vulnerable damage increase rare and magic nodes, simple as that, and here's where my actual personal Paragon points run out, so I'm just going to sort of show you the outline of what my plans are for the remaining few points. You want to go down through the actual rare and magic nodes to get to the glyph socket itself, inside of which we're going to be putting the Ambidextrous glyph, which gives you a bonus to all magic nodes in the radius, but also just gives you multiplicative increased damage while wielding one-handed weapons, which again, all of our skills will be tied to thanks to Ramaladni's. Then after you've got all the rare and magic nodes in the radius and you've fueled up the glyph, you want to head directly up to get to the legendary node itself for 10% multiplicative bonus damage for 5 seconds after making an enemy vulnerable, as well as an extra 10% if you overpower a vulnerable enemy, which we don't do all that often. This isn't an overpower build, but this is still at minimum 10% multiplicative damage and an occasional bonus to that too. After that, we want to head back down to the Warbringer board actually, and then we're going to be heading down here to actually exit onto the final board that we're adding, which is going to be the Hemorrhage board here, and here you want to have the legendary node in the top right just for ease of access. You go directly from here to the legendary node as simply as possible, following as much strength as you can, and of course the power here is your bleeding damage is increased by 15% of your vulnerable damage bonus. Right now, what this actually gives me is 21% increased bleed damage. It could be quite a bit bigger. I don't have quite the perfect vulnerable damage stats, so this is another area for growth from my build in the actual footage. Then with your final points, you just want to round off and grab these rare and magic physical damage and damage over time nodes up here. They're just that last little bit of extra power that we can pump in with our last couple of points. And that pretty much just does it for our Paragon board. All the actual putting the build together parts are pretty much just covered now, so let's talk about how to play the build and any of the actual nuances of it. If you are at the start of a dungeon or about to fight enemies for a long period of time, or if you're starting a boss, anything like that, you always want to start with Wrath of the Berserker and then building its damage bonus by dumping as much fury as you can into Rencast as much as physically possible for the next few seconds. After that, you want to build your fury back up, then press charge to keep the berserking buff active. As long as your berserking stays active, your damage stays boosted, so your goal is to never drop the berserking buff from that point forward. That said, avoid using charge unless it will hit at least 3 enemies, or a boss specifically, as that is how we manage the cooldown reduction. There's a lot of funky ways that you can move to maximize charge as well, especially when fighting enemies that don't die to a singular charge. Combined with the Ghostwalker aspect, you can sort of just walk back and forth and funnel 2 groups into one group, sort of like you're sweeping a broom back and forth, except it's a very, very spiky one. It's just a really malleable skill that makes it genuinely fun to play around as the basis of a build. Aside from that, if you charge a group and they are still alive, if there are 3 or more of them left, charge again. If there are less than that, use Rupture. Challenging Shout is either a defensive emergency button or a 4-second cooldown reset for your other abilities depending on the situation. Then we should talk about boss fights quickly. Quite simply, in these you just need to play it like a normal Rend build with frequent charges. Charge on cooldown, still of course, it's still really important, especially to keep your berserking up, but otherwise Rend if at high fury, Frenzy if at low fury, and Rupture to pop the bleeds and get more vulnerable procs if necessary. That pretty much does it then, everyone. My favorite current Barbarian build that we have, and the only genuinely new one this season, or at least the only genuinely new one that is also worth using and talking about from both the power side of things and considering the fun factor too, of course. This way of playing is just, it's making me enjoy the season much more than I was before, so I absolutely wanted to share it with you all. It's just fun, simple as that. Like if you liked the video, subscribe to the notification bell for more, and most importantly, ladies and gentlemen, until next time, stay sweet.
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.